My name is Karl Lentini. Thank you for watching the Men of Law podcast. I'm very pleased today to have Dr. Jack Kruse with us. He's a brain surgeon. And thank you, doctor, for being here.
Right, no problem.
So I wanted to start off with asking you about sunlight's effect on our behavior. I've got my film here, and it's about child trafficking. And I don't like to use the P word, but what motivates the whole child trafficking business is people messing with kids. So is there a sunlight or lack of sunlight factor that can cause perverse behaviors?
Yeah, absolutely. It starts with the way our brain was built by evolution. And you have to know that we're the one animal in the last 600 million years that has something pretty unique about our brains, which is frontal lobes. And those frontal lobes are extremely specialized in us. But the frontal lobes in man are, how shall we say, very fragile, fragile to the way we're designed. And it begins with light coming through the eye. That light goes to a part of the brain that you probably have heard of, but may not know too much about, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the master clock in the body. But it also goes to another place called the habenular nucleus, and the habenular nucleus is the relay station to the frontal lobes. So this key pathway is like the feed in. So when you understand that aberrant light through this pathway starts the process to not only aberrant behavior, but it also affects sexual behavior, especially. Why? Because where does this pathway continue into the brain? Continues into a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is actually where many of the sex steroid hormones that are pretty famous out there are made. And a lot of people who have followed my work, especially I'd say in the last 5 or 6 years, when I was on Rick Rubin's podcast with Huberman, some of the things that hit the editing room floor that no one wanted to talk about is how blue light, non-native EMF, and polarized light make you sexually aberrant. That means boys become girls, girls become boys. Also, it can stimulate unusual sexual proclivities. So the science is there. The problem is people don't want to talk about it. And where most of the science was really laid out, where these things were found, was through the MK Ultra program, that the CIA basically got informed from Meyer Lansky through his work with General Groves during the Manhattan Project. And it's been developed from the 1940s all the way to now. That program has moved from Washington University in St. Louis to Stanford Research Institute, now to the Brain Health Initiative. And most of the high level stuff that I think is affecting people here in the United States now has been checked and rechecked over the last 20 years down in South America in people that have myelin. And the reason why, I shouldn't say myelin, but melanin. And the reason why is people who have a lot of melanin tend to be resistant to a lot of these changes. People who aren't heavily melanated tend not to. And this goes back the full circle of the story I just told you. Why is this a big issue? That central retinal pathway that allows everything to come in and change these things, within that central retinal pathway, there's a key mammalian target called the leptin melanocortin pathway. That is the pathway that has to be absconded so that you can change and sculpt the things distal or downstream to lead to the aberrant behavior. And that loop, the way in which it works is when light comes through it, the mitochondria in the leptin melanocortin pathway, the central retinal pathways, changes the way mitochondria are able to perform tasks. Those tasks people learned about in biochemistry. And it turns out that melanin, one of the interesting things about it that very few people talk about, is it absorbs all frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. But here's the real big part for your question. Melanin does something that's even more amazing. It's a metal chelator. And it turns out evolution built this in us because way back when, we're talking about in the great oxygenation event 2 billion years ago, 2.5 billion years ago, the planet was filled with dirty chemistry. Okay. And melanin co-evolved even before melatonin so that we could clean the dirty chemistry so that we could get to a place where we are post-Cambrian explosion, which is about 600 million years ago when life showed up everywhere on Earth. And then we could use optics to signal. Why is this important? Because the end part of mitochondrial biology not only is a chemistry thing. Most people know the waste products of mitochondria are water and carbon dioxide. But here's the other big thing that comes out of mitochondria that very few people in centralized healthcare or centralized science talk about. Mitochondria makes light, makes biophotons called ultra weak biophotons. And it turns out that that light that comes out is the sculpting wand that goes back to why people's frontal lobes, why their hypothalamus, why the things in them can be crafted so that they turn into child predators, so that they turn into, part of the LGBT community. People, like I would say Lady Gaga want people to believe that they're born that way. There are some people that are born that way because of the way transgenerational epigenetics works, but most of the people, the aberrant behavior, like the behaviors that we're currently seeing in Minnesota, these are sculpted behaviors from the aberrant ultra weak biophotons that are created within this pathway.
So what is the solution? What is it? Just
the solution is actually an N equals 1. You have to realize that the industrial military complex moved us from an agricultural to industrial, now to an information economy. And what people don't realize, every time you plug in to the AC power grid, you're creating polarized light around you. I mean, it shocks people when they look into the details of this. But we now live in a world that's filled with polarized light. And you have to realize polarized light is what changes all these things. So to answer your question simply, you need to go on a non-native EMF polarized light diet. The problem is that's really hard to do when everybody is shilling, things that plug into the power grid. It's kind of like saying I want to get clean of heroin, but I live in a heroin den. And that's what makes it really difficult. And this is the reason why also, if you look, you're an old enough guy to know this. When I was growing up, the amount of aberrant sexual behavior, it was present, but it was not overwhelming like it is now. The same thing is true with people's behaviors. Everything has gotten more bizarre. And part of the reason why is because the use of technology, tech screens that make this aberrant light that sculpt our tissues is now ubiquitous. You can't run away from it. I don't care where you are, even in the Amazon rainforest, which I was in 2 years ago. The people there that are bush people, they still had access to technology. So when you begin to understand how these things work, and it does take a tour de force of understanding not only neuroanatomy, but molecular biology, but the big thing is quantum biology. These things, everything I've told you today, is discoverable. Like, you can go to the literature and find, the papers that link all this. The big issue for the government, the industrial military complex, they try to block the information flow to the general public so that they don't know these things can happen. And, one of the places where it recently came to the surface was when, Trump went in and used an Israeli directed energy weapon to harvest Maduro, and everybody saw on Twitter the comments from Maduro's guards where he said that they came down with this weapon that just zapped us and none of us could do anything. We just didn't understand this type of weaponry. In other words, they didn't have a previous history with this. These weapons have been developed from the 60s onward, and anybody who thinks that they're not available just doesn't understand truly what's going on behind the doors of DARPA and what's going on behind the doors in Palantir, because all of these things have been used. and they'll continue to be used. Why? Because now the information economy, now we're moving into a new realm, which is transhumanist tech surveillance. That's the big battle that we're between right now on a geopolitical stage in Trump's administration, between the bankers and this other group. And these two groups are warring because they believe that their approach to control is better than the other. And obviously, the bankers have been doing this since 1812, since the Battle of Waterloo with the Napoleonic Wars, when, one of the Rothschilds family, I think it was Nathan, said, I don't care who rules England, as long as I have control of the money supply, I control the people. That's where the idea first came for control. And you should know, Karl, since you're involved heavily with the trafficking of children, that links back directly to the Rothschild clan and the people that run Israel. They're the leaders in the pack. Every single website that's really out there that's feeds into aberrant behavior is owned by someone tied to Zionism as a political ideology. And many times they have dual passports, to Israel. And when you understand that, you go, well, how did this link come? Well, you have to remember, what is child trafficking or a proclivity to want to control children? It's a control mechanism. Okay. It's a blackmail mechanism. There's lots of things in politics and history that show that this was a case. The best one that I think most Americans know about is J. Edgar Hoover. He was controlled by Meyer Lansky because he was a flaming homosexual, and everybody knew that Lansky had the dirt on him. Well, who started that? How did Lansky get that? It started back with Queen Victoria when she became the queen in 1837. People from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which is where her family was from, that's what her monarchy was, they would start to use blackmail. And the best way to blackmail people is when you have sexual data on them. Why? Because it's embarrassing. Okay. Fast forward, let's say 100 years. What president to the United States most people know about? Well, they know that, John F. Kennedy was controlled by a lot of the elements tied to this story, with the stories about Marilyn Monroe. Where did it really get big? Well, that's when Clinton got into office. Monica Lewinsky was the honeypot, for the Mossad. And that's famously why when Jeffrey Epstein gets arrested, we walk into his bedroom, we see a picture of Bill Clinton wearing red shoes, and you know what the red shoes mean, and he's in a blue dress. Then they go into the bedroom, and then they see George W. Bush playing with two Jenga towers and paper airplanes. These are signs that people tied to the bankers have been using for blackmail to get things out of it. And where did this idea start? It's pretty simple. It was Meyer Lansky, who didn't really think you needed to own assets. This is what made him different than the Rothschilds. You didn't need to own assets to control people. What did you need? You need to have good blackmail on them. And most of the blackmail that he had on politicians of the day when he was alive was sexual varieties. And that he was not the first person, in history to do this. It started with the people that were linked, to the bankers and to the monarchy. And, I don't think I have to go through a history lesson with most people. We know that Prince Andrew was just ostracized and excommunicated from the royal family because he was tied to the pedo stuff with Epstein on the island. And then what else links back to the story so people can put it all together? Who is the bankers for Epstein and a lot of the royal family? Jamie Dimon. Okay. This is all discoverable. Who is now a known banker for the transhumanist technologists? Well, that's Sergey Brin with Google for surveillance technology. Same thing. Who introduced Sergey to Dimon? Do you know?
No.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh.
So you also have to realize that the bankers on Wall Street, the people today that are doing everything possible to take our country apart, these are the people that are banking both sides, that are fighting over this control aspect. So the things that you're really interested in, Karl, which is, why is this happening to children in our country? I don't think that people are going to like my diagnosis of this, but if you understand what MK Ultra was about, we went from controlling people with drugs. That's when Stanley Gottlieb famously, sprinkled LSD over St. Louis from Washington University in the 1950s, that Bobby Kennedy talked about when he was running for president. Then it morphed into the use of light. First, it was wired light, then became wireless light. Then famously, we had the time between JFK and Clinton, where the Bush family cartel, and yes, I did say Bush, where George H., that's the older first president in the early Gulf War, set up an offshore bank and a money laundering scheme to launder drugs into the United States. Okay. And he taught his son how to do that banking. Where was that based? In the Caribbean. If you want to know the reason why Venezuela was just blown up, is because Trump and the transhumanist technologist wanted to blow up the drug thing. But what happened? What was the correlate from the drug casino that they were running? They found out there was a more profitable way to run black ops. And you know what that was? By running children through. Do you want to know the reason why it was more profitable, Carl? Because when you use drugs, you have to make the drugs down in South America, get them into Mexico, and then into the United States, with Venezuela being the bank, and then the royal family setting up the chain in the Caribbean islands through the Isle of Man and all of their places in the Cayman Islands. During that time, one of the things that the people that like to traffic children and are into pornography, who are, sexual deviants, they said, if you have a child, you can use the child over and over and over again. In other words, it's like using an 8-ball of cocaine 150 times. So guess what that means? You profit tremendously from that. And then what was happening at the same time? The industrial military complex was creating a world in which polarized light was around. So you had way more people that were sexual predators and sexual deviants. So the market for their product expanded tremendously. And when you understand that a child from, 4 years old all the way up to 21 years old becomes more profitable than, the coca fields that are in Medellin, Colombia, it shouldn't be, rocket science to figure out why this is taken off. Why? Because behind it all is always the fiat dollar. And know that those are linked to the people in elite banking. And if you look at the history of what has gone on with Epstein specifically, because he's the guy that's come to the surface the most, who was his girlfriend? Ghislaine Maxwell. Who is she tied to? The bankers and the royal family in the in the UK. Robert Maxwell is well-known tied to all this issue. And when you actually begin to see the tentacles of all this, it becomes obvious why this is going to be a really big thing to take apart, because these people have been building this network and trying to normalize sexual deviancy for probably about 75 years. And I think you can see in culture now, they've done a pretty good job. Why? Because the people that are tied to the bankers, who also have dual passports, also own Netflix and entertainment companies. They own all the media companies. So when you see that the entire casino operation for deviancy, which is way more profitable than Americans want to believe, anybody who thinks drugs is as profitable as child trafficking doesn't understand economics 101.
Right. Well, it's terrible tragedy, and the more I look into it, the more I realize how hard it's going to be to stop it because of all these forces, international financial forces you're talking about.
Right. The best way to stop it, to be honest with you, is for the sun to hit the planet in something that happened. The last time this happened was in 1859, called the Carrington event. That's when a coronal mass ejection hit the planet and knocked out the power grid. If you knocked out the power grid, the distribution for most of this pornography and most of this deviancy would be taken care of. Now, short of that, the only other way to do it is to make sure that you have good judges and a good AG to put these people in jail. And you can see in the United States, you know, we have our president here in El Salvador famously said at a CPAC speech on February 22nd, 2023, he told the then not President Trump that if you want to fix the United States, that you have to make sure the judges and the AG put the bad guys in jail. Well, here we are in 2026. We have an AG that told us that, yeah, there's an Epstein list. Oh, no, there's not an Epstein list. And we're not going to do anything about it. Still to this day, nobody from the banking elite that we know were tied to the surveillance tech bros that are also sexual deviants, not one of them have come and been put in jail. In fact, we have data, very strong data, that many of the deviant people are being protected by the judges. In fact, Kash Patel and Bondi are two of those people. We have a guy named Dan Bongino who's out there who talked a big, tough game. And then when he got in there, what did he do? He actually protected the pedos from Epstein Island and got on the program and said, yeah, I don't think I can do anything about this. Our own president, who railed against Epstein before he got elected, now says you're an idiot if you talk about it. Well, my personal opinion is as soon as he said that, as soon as Bondi did what she did, and as soon as Kash did what she did, that patriots in the United States should continue talking about this constantly. Why? Because this is how the industrial military complex, the deep state, makes more money than anything else. And the only way for us to blow this up short of a CME is we have to put sunlight as a disinfectant on all of these people. These people, not my opinion is, not only do they need to be prosecuted, I believe they need to be put to death. And until we see nooses hung on streets with corrupt politicians and people involved with both drug trafficking, money laundering, and these child trafficking rings. I mean, we know that our last president, Biden, was involved heavily in child trafficking through Guatemala. I mean, that's the country that's right next to us. We have the attorney general in Guatemala who comes to El Salvador all the time, telling the people here in El Salvador what the United States was doing in their country. And basically, it was, I wouldn't say killing fields. I would tell you for child trafficking, Guatemala was probably like a poppy field in Afghanistan, where the children grow up, as soon as they get to 4 years old, then they were trafficked straight into the United States with the help of the cartels. And who set this entire system up? The Bush family. The Bush family set this up. Most people don't even know the history of really what NAFTA was about. NAFTA's key goal, and most people ascribe NAFTA to Clinton, wrong answer. If you go back and look at history, the last week of George H. Bush's presidency was getting NAFTA through. What did NAFTA effectively do? It privatized everything in North America so that then the cartel that they had built in the Caribbean would then link South America to Mexico and the money train of the drugs. That fueled the next step, which was child trafficking. And once you had control of the cartels in northern Mexico, the issue of getting children into the United States became very, very easy. Then you have guys like Alan Dershowitz, who again, who's that? That is a lawyer who was the lawyer of Jeffrey Epstein, comes out in Harvard Review and says, we need to start to normalize child pedophilia. That this is now, back when he first said it in the 90s, people thought it was crazy. And then when he came out as part of Epstein's list, and you started seeing like Prince Andrew, why is it that men who are 40 and 50 and 60 years old have this proclivity for children? Well, that's when you have to start asking the questions that you asked me in the beginning. The MK Ultra program is pretty much why this started, but this has been, how shall we say, a characteristic of the elites running governments that go all the way back to, I would tell you, pre-United States. This has been a huge problem for a long time, but now it's at a global scale. And you have to realize when people began to realize there was huge amounts of money in this to fulfill this demand, that's when you begin to see the real magnitude of the problem. Like most people in the United States think fentanyl and Suboxone and all this stuff is a big problem. That's a problem, but child trafficking trumps that because it's way more profitable. And anything that's profitable is going to be a business that the criminal element, the cabal behind the deep state will protect. And that's what you're seeing right now. That's the reason why so many people on Twitter, on social media can't figure out Kash Patel and Bondi. Why? Because you got to remember, before Bondi was in Trump's issue, who was she? She was the lawyer that worked on Jeb Bush's campaign when he ran against Trump first time. Okay? She is a huge link to the Bush family cartel. What else does she do? She actually was the lawyer for Pfizer. How did that relationship come? That's Susie Wiles. Susie Wiles, also part of the Bush family cartel. So when you see this octopus tentacle, you have to realize that that's now reached inside the halls of Congress, the executive branch. I would tell you there's maybe 2 or 3 Congress people that aren't affected at some level by this story that you're trying to go through. But much like President Bukele said, people in America have no chance of getting back their country until you start putting the bad people in jail. And that means that the Department of Justice has to be free and clear to do the job they're doing. And I don't care if you're left, right, or independent. There is no doubt that nothing is happening when it comes to the Epstein case. They're doing everything in their power not to let it out. Yet, Ghislaine Maxwell sits in prison, but apparently she has no victims, according to our own justice system.
No victims and no names released of the perps.
Oh, we do know some of them. I mean, the girl that was just killed, Jeffrey, came out. She's the one that fingered. Right. She's the one that fingered Prince Andrew, and we do know that his brother, the king, just excommunicated him from the royal family. Why? Because it got too hot in the kitchen. But what's happened? You know, all the other psyops that's going on in the UK now with Starmer, most of the people in the UK don't realize how huge an issue this is. And, you know, this ties directly to the immigration problem. You know, when you can't use our own military to perform an invasion on us, but you can use brown people from inside the tropics to come and let them ruin your country. And that's exactly what's going on in Minneapolis. That's what's going on in the UK. That's what's going on in France. And remember, who do we have in France? We have a president that by all accounts looks like he's married to a man who wants to be a woman. So you've got to say to yourself, dude, when you see this at the highest levels of government, and even the people in France who tried to vote for Marine Le Pen, they kept the installed power. This extends right up to, you know, who's running the EU. Christine Lagarde is an actual convicted felon, but she is the face for the bankers at the BIS. Again, what did I tell you? It comes back to money. Mm-hmm. And this is the most profitable thing that elites in power have found. And they're not going to go quietly. They're not going to allow this to go because it fuels the source, the thermodynamic source of their power. And you need to understand that. And you need to do everything you possibly can not to participate in that crazy loop. But when you want my diagnosis as a brain surgeon, yeah, we started this out with the central retinal pathways and the left and melanocortin pathway. And I just took you all the way up to current events that is present, you know, in the New York Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Star in the UK, you know, the Guardian. It's everywhere. I don't think people really understand how bad it really is and what two sides are fighting with each other. And to be quite frank with you, both sides, for at least the issue you're interested in, which is child trafficking, they're both involved in that. So it doesn't matter which side wins, kids still lose.
Well, I hope my film can at least raise some awareness. We're always looking for villains in movies, and you have ready-made, actual real-life villains there.
Well, I got news for you. The villains are in every single government. The real problem, the way I see it, Karl, is that we, the people, have been anesthetized. We haven't done a good job of really understanding how this process happened. And I think we, the people, especially in the United States, I think they're beginning to wake up that the Biden clan and the Trump clan are basically two wings of the same nut. All they sell you is a different propaganda side of the story, but they're both heavily involved in the same issues. And I think when really it comes down to it, I try to get people to go back and read the Federalist Papers about what Madison, Adams, and Jefferson were talking about before the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence was made. When the government is run by criminals like this, we have a duty as patriots to get rid of it. And I think that's what we need to do. The interesting thing, I do believe the government in the United States also wants that to happen so that they can get rid of the Constitution, because the Constitution has been a problem for the criminal cabal for 250 years. That Constitution is really good, but right now nobody's following it. If we do ever get to the point where we do have a civil war where the people get rid of the government, we need to go back and strengthen the Constitution. We don't need a new one. But we need to understand how people in politics and the banking elite ruined it. Thomas Jefferson told us that the bankers would ruin it, 250 years ago, and boy, was he right. And I think now when you realize that idea of Jefferson is time traveled all the way to where we are now, anybody who's a good historian over the last 250 years can see the mistakes we made. Most of the mistakes really began at the turn of the 20th century, right when Queen Victoria died, and we allowed people of her ilk, they were called Fabians, to infiltrate the United States government. The first infiltration started at the Treaty of Versailles, and then it eventually morphed into Woodrow Wilson's presidency when we got the Federal Reserve. And when you understand that that's when banking really got their tentacles into politics in the United States, it slowly got us to the place that we are now in 2026. And we need to scrub that. We need to cut that umbilical cord, because that, gets rid of the thermodynamics. The problem is they have other ways. They've been stealing from us for that long, but this child trafficking, the drug money, this is now what we call a shadow Federal Reserve for them. Creates huge amounts of money that is outside the Fed system, so it doesn't matter. And that's the reason why now you have this new group of transhumanist technologists, because they've built this system. They've perfected it, and they believe now that they can go to war with the people that built the original system. And that's fundamentally the risk game that's going on in geopolitics. The stuff that you're talking about, Karl, it's a symptom of a bigger disease. And I think, hopefully in your movie, you donate about 5 or 10 minutes to talk about this history, because I believe if you don't understand where it came from, that you can never solve the problem.
Well, I hope the film does well and I can make a series of films, because there's a lot here. In a movie, I have an hour and a half, so I hope I get to make more on this topic. I'd like to go in another direction, Doctor. And again, it relates back to the sun and the brain. I've had people in my life who I've lost with dementia and Alzheimer's. And so what is the effect of sunlight or lack of sunlight in developing dementia?
Yeah, well, the number one thing that you need to understand, to give you a very quick, how shall we say, walk through my brain, what I've come up with the last 20 years, you need to go to the circadian mechanism. What controls it? Light, dark, and temperature. Those are the three metrics. That's why it's decentralized. One is not more important than the other. But based on what I told you about that central retinal pathway with light through the eye, basically what happens is there's two clocks. One is the supracosmatic clock. The other one is a vitamin A clock called the ROR RXR receptor that controls all the other clocks in your body. Once you lose control of those, what does mitochondria do? I told you they make light. Turns out when the light is aberrant, okay, it causes proteins to misfold. When proteins misfold, that's where dementia comes from. So I want you to think about this common sense wise. If you and I were sitting in a movie theater and we were trying to see your movie, but somebody put a filter on your movie projector and we couldn't see the light rays properly on the screen, would you be able to see the movie? The answer is no. That's exactly what dementia is. So someone, through the process of modern life, which is all the things we talked about, is feeding us polarized light that create misfolded proteins. That's how you get frontal temporal dysplasia. That's how you get Parkinson's. That's how you get Alzheimer's. That's how you get all the diseases that are tied to dementia. Now, are there other ways meaning upstream to cause this problem? Yes. But the ultimate effect, what's the common distillation, is that the light that comes out of mitochondria is aberrant. It's no longer coherent so that it cannot control the electronic structure on proteins or in the water that surrounds them. And when that very fine electronics is broken, proteins misfold. When proteins misfold, that's where dementia comes from.
So if I understand, sun comes through the eyes, it causes
sun makes the perfect movie so that proteins and water work fine, so that your brain works fine. In other words, we can see Karl's movie. When you put polarized light through, that's light from Netflix, light from a screen, light from an LED bulb, light from, let's try to make it simple. 5,000 years ago, when the Egyptians were around, they used to use temples and fire. Fire is actually polarized light. So people don't realize that artificial light goes all the way back. If you really want to take it further back, 4.6 billion years, when you get clouds on Earth, more cosmic radiation comes in. That also is capable of doing it. So this story is a really, really long story. Polarized light isn't a friend of evolutionary biology. Turns out what is unpolarized light from the sun in the visible spectrum from about 250 to about 3100. That is the light that we're designed to work with. If you live mostly in that light, you will not get dementia. If you live mostly in the other parts of the spectrum, you will get dementia. And that's the reason why right now, people in Maha don't like to talk about this, but my belief is that dementia, specifically from Alzheimer's, is now the #1 killer in the United States. And that's been taken and how shall we say, hidden, because no one wants people to know that that's the effect of using technology through the 20th and 21st century.
I have maybe an ignorant question, but I know inflammation causes a lot of problems in our body and the brain. So does sunlight reduce inflammation in the body?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a calcium channel blocker. So remember, when somebody has high blood pressure, it means, what is inflammation? Too many protons, not enough electrons. So when you're in sunlight is a calcium channel blocker. What does big pharma sell people to deal with high blood pressure? They sell them calcium channel blockers like verapamil. So they're using the same path. They know what they're doing, but they want to make sure that they get the dermatologist and ophthalmologist to make you afraid of the sun, because if you're afraid of the sun, you need their drug. Okay? That's really where it comes down to. And then when you understand fundamentally, when a doctor uses the word inflammation, what does it really mean at the physics level? It means too many protons, not enough electrons, meaning too much positive charge, not enough negative charge. Well, the sun reestablishes in your body, every cell, that net negative charge. That's what the redox potential is from cytochrome 1 to cytochrome 4. And you need about a negative 400 millivolt charge there. When you understand the basics of the wiring diagram of mitochondria, and then you begin to understand what controls that wiring diagram, it goes back to the first question you asked me in this podcast. Melanin. Melanin controls 4 atoms, and those 4 atoms do very different things. What are those atoms? Iron, copper, manganese, and molybdenum. Okay? The chemical signals, for those of you who are not scientists, Fe, Cu, Mn, and Mo. You can look them up. They all have different effects directly on mitochondria. Why is that important, Carl? Remember that light show I told you that comes out? You have to have control of those 4 atoms to control the light show that comes out of your mitochondria. And that's the reason why what's on your surface controls what's inside. And that evolutionary story began 2.5 billion years ago in the Great Oxygenation Event, when the environment was dirty. And what did we effectively do? We made it undirty by utilizing, those big issues. And just to give you a simple flavor so you understand this, because I know you're not a science guy and your question wasn't ignorant, it was a good one. I will tell you that copper itself is an atom that ties to the story that I've already gave you. It's a cofactor for cytochrome C oxidase that makes water, but it also is a cofactor for RAR dependent transcription. What does that mean? It means that it controls the vitamin A clock in the body that controls all the other clocks. That's the reason why circadian biology goes crazy when you have this problem. So when you don't get sun, you get what we call a relative copper deficiency, because there becomes an imbalance between copper and molybdenum. So here's the interesting, part for you to hear on this. Try to make this as simple as I can. Basically, sunlight optimizes melanin on your body, and that melanin keeps those metal atoms in you running perfectly so you can make the light show that you need to run all of your biology. That's effectively what's really important. And it turns out all these atoms have to be quantized. What does that mean? Tightly controlled. When you lose control of this, it's a big issue. So the analogy I want to give you, because a lot of people who listen to this I know are not scientists, but I want to make it so that you get it really simply. You do know that there's a difference between some humans that eat a carnivore diet and then people eat a vegetarian diet. So let me explain to you the fundamental physics behind why a vegetarian or vegan diet is a bad idea, and then I'll scale it to an evolutionary story so you understand it. A vegan diet creates an imbalance between copper and molybdenum, okay? So when you eat a vegan diet, the amount of molybdenum that's in your body is off the chain. Copper doesn't do its job. When copper's not there, you don't make enough water, okay? So we know that there's a 5,000-year history of vegans that live in India. How did they get away with it? Remember the story that I told you? Even when you eat a bad diet, if you have good control of melanin on your skin, and most Indians, are heavily melanated, and they live outside, they like going in the Ganges River, they up doing yoga every morning, then guess what? The bad diet that they've chosen doesn't harm them. That's why for 5,000 years, they've done okay. Now, what happens when you take the vegans and you move them to Detroit? Well, we got a problem, okay? And that's the same reason why when you move Somalis to Detroit or to Minnesota, you start to see a lot of this aberrant behavior as well, because it turns out that the melanin can no longer control those 4 atoms, those metal chelators. And what happens? Your mitochondria can't work as good in those environments, and it creates an abnormal signal that is the movie show that controls the things in their head. That's why they act like fucking crazy people, okay? And people don't understand how the system fundamentally was built by biology in the Great Oxygenation Event. Very similar to the story that I gave you before about people don't understand where sexual deviance came from in this story as well, because they don't understand how a change in light can lead to optical signaling changes in the brain. But when you understand fundamentally, and you can explain to a group of people how it happens, and they can fact check you, you begin to see a different side of civilization and biology. And you begin to understand truly what the elites are doing. They know a lot of this information and they control it. If you want to know the reason why sunglasses, sunscreen, and demonizing the sun is a big issue in organized religions and politics, now you know the reason why. Because it leads to control of the people that are in their flock. That's exactly why it happens.
Like in the way you've talked about the casinos.
Correct.
No windows in the casinos, no clocks.
Right. Not only that, everything inside is blue lit. There's no, Pink Floyd spectrum in there of 7 lights. It's basically a huge spike of blue. And what does that do? It destroys all the optical signaling so that they don't have to put a gun in front of your head. They just reach in your pocket and you give them the money. It's like Plato's allegory of the cave. And I would tell you the same thing is true with child trafficking. When you do this to enough people, 2, 3, 4, 5 billion people, all of a sudden you create about 10 or 15% that I don't think there's any problem having sex with an 8-year-old child. And do you see this even in some organized religions? Yeah, you see it. I mean, most people know about the Zionists in New York that had underground, tunnels in Brooklyn, and they pulled up all these, mattresses that are bloodstained and everything else. We know what was going on there. We can go to the Middle East right now and see in another organized religion, Islam, where you'll see pregnant girls at 12, 13 years old. That's the reason things have changed. And people don't understand why they've changed. It's very understandable when you understand the quantum biologic story about actually how signaling works. And when you disrupt the signaling on the surface, which goes inside, a lot of talks that I've given over the years where I really first gave this exposition was in a place called Vermont in 2018. It's you can look at it on YouTube. It was about a 3-hour talk about how this process starts. But what I will say to you, there was a slide in the beginning of it. It said, before I'm done, I'm off this planet, I'm going to prove to you that surface changes determine everything in medicine and everything in biology. And it's amazing to me that people understand that when you don't get in the sun, you don't make vitamin D. What does vitamin D do? It's made on the surface of your skin from cholesterol. Then it has to go to the liver and kidney to be converted to the active part. Isn't that surface changes changing the inside? Everybody knows that. But yet they had a huge problem when I said, well, melanin does the same thing. And then when you understand that melanin, also mostly on your surface, goes in and changes your ability to use glycolysis, the TCA cycle or urea cycle. Those are the 3 major cycles in biochemistry. People are stunned. And I'm like, well, doesn't it follow the same evolutionary story of vitamin D? It does. Then the last one that I think most people will probably know because you see all the commercials for Hims on the NFL Network. What's another surface layer that goes to the inside? Nitric oxide. When you're in UV light, you make nitric oxide on your skin. And what does that do? It vasodilates things. So when people don't go in the sun enough, their peckers don't work. So what are people doing now? They're taking Cialis, Viagra, and all these medications, okay? Because they can't make nitrogen. Well, you'd be surprised to know, Carl, that out of those 4 atoms, they're tied to this story. You have to have those as cofactors in order to clean the body for the nitrogen waste products. That's actually one of the things that these 4 atoms do. So let's do a hard stop. I just gave you melanin, vitamin D, and nitric oxide. You know what the link is to all of them, my friend? UV light. You got it. UV light on the skin. So I want you to do a hard stop and go, wow, I didn't realize how this all goes back. And do you understand really how a psyops works? A psyops works because the fish only sees the bait, never sees the hook. Okay? That is what my profession has been told from the Rockefeller bankers that took over medicine in 1911, 2 years before they took over the Federal Reserve. That was called the Flexner Report. And what did they do? They took out all the natural medicine, all the decentralized medicine, and basically installed Big Pharma's ideas. So what was one of the first things that came up in Big Pharma, the first 20, 30 years of Rockefeller medicine? We need to make sure the sun is toxic. Because when we keep people out of the sun, guess what happens? We gain control of those three mechanisms. We make everybody vitamin D deficient. Nobody has control of their mitochondria. And no one can make nitric oxide that makes their blood pressure go up. Now, back then, they didn't know about the nitric oxide system because we didn't find that out until 92 to 98. But they knew that you kept people out of the sun, their blood pressure went up. How do we know that? Because all the people in England from 1870 to 1910, they all had these weird diseases tied to diseases of darkness, like rickets. They had T-cell cancers on their scrotums and things like that. We knew that there was a big link. No one can physically explain it, but the one thing that the big pharma guys knew is if we keep people out of the sun, they get them sick and we can sell them shit and become rich. And remember, behind every deviancy, behind every psyops, Karl, because that's what you seem to be interested in, money is the root of all evil. That's where it comes down to. That's why I'm telling you that Thomas Jefferson was brilliant, because he knew that pathology in society and civilization began and started with the bankers. And the bankers are the ones that are behind the elite. They're the ones that hold the dagger to the carotid artery. If you really want to know who I think killed Charlie Kirk, the same people, okay? They want to keep this system going as long as they can, and they knew if Charlie Kirk ever became a president down in the United States, he wouldn't be as controllable as Kamala, Biden, or Trump. So they couldn't have him be prominent. They couldn't have him rise up so that he would elevate we the people to replace these criminal fucks.
Well, I find it interesting. Most people aren't aware that the Federal Reserve is not a federal agency. It's private banks, and that the Constitution never set it up. It wasn't there.
No, it's not only that. Same thing with income tax.
Right.
So you need to understand that the years of I'd say 1911 to 1917 were the most damaging part of the constitutional republic. And who did that? It was Congress, but specifically Woodrow Wilson. That's why he's the worst president we've ever had. Now, I don't expect most modern humans to understand that because they're really shitty historians, because nobody in the school system teaches you this stuff. But, you know, I'm an old school cat that did go to really good schools, and I learned all this stuff. Not only that, one of the people that were the architects of this in New York in 1960 and 1970, I happened to work for, and he taught me about how the people from Saxe-Coburg Gotha became B'nai B'rith and eventually the ADL in the United States, and how those fades intercalated into America at that time and used a lot of different psyops to get control not only of Congress, but the executive branch. And what's really happened is that cancer's metastasized, you know, to where we are today, you know, and it makes it really difficult for guys like you who are doing movies on the distal stuff. Like, you're showing the symptom instead of the root cause of the disease. And you're hoping that the symptom disgusts people so bad that they'll do something about it. I have a fundamental belief that when you realize that most of the people that be watching your movie already addicted to the polarized light, it's really hard to show them the light of day. So you have to teach them the history lesson, but what you have to do is put your fingers in their nose and bring them out in the sun before you show them the movie. They need to get control of their brain back.
Wow. Wow.
Well, that's why I'm sitting in the sun.
Yeah.
That's why I'm at the 13 North latitude, my friend.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've decided I'm not going to play by their rules. The history of centralization in society is a history of humanity destruction. And when you fundamentally understand that pillar of my decentralized thesis, then you'll see where I take you, just like I try to take you in this podcast with your first question. I hope the people who go back and listen to what I said an hour ago realize we started with a biologic question. And that biologic question is now taking you in places that you can't imagine. So when people tell me that what I'm teaching people is conspiracy theory, I'm going to say to you, Karl, one big thing. It can't be a conspiracy theory when there's patents and papers that support my belief. The key is the people in power are going to tell you that I'm a crazy bastard because they're going to keep blocking me. That's the reason why people have a hard time finding me on X, or people have a hard time finding me on the internet now. Why? Because I show you the first principle data that I'm right. And then when you realize that I'm right, then you have a choice. And that choice is already written for you 2,500 years ago. That's Plato's allegory of the cave. Do you decide to be the slave that gets out in the sun and go, hey guys, everything's really good here? Or do you just put your hands together, put you back in the handcuffs and stay in the cave? Right now, my opinion, 7.5 billion of you have gone back in the cave. There's about 500 million of us that are out here in the sun looking at you assholes going, what the hell's wrong with you? That's really what's going on January 30th, 2026. My opinion.
I'd like to, Doctor, go in another direction, if you don't mind. I've heard you say you're a deeply spiritual person, and you talked about the biophotons. So our body literally generates light. So am I being hopeful or off base by thinking that there's some spiritual connection there?
Well, I mean, the way I like to describe this to non-scientists, because you know that scientists have their own religion. They don't think anything in the Bible is real. But I direct people always to Genesis. Go to 1:1 to 1:15. What does God effectively tell humanity? Let there be light. You know where God fails us? He never tells us the recipe. So, Karl, when you go back to the beginning of this podcast, what did I tell you? A big part of the recipe of what really happened in the Great Oxygenation Event, what happened at the Cambrian explosion, and what happened since. These are all things that Charles Darwin couldn't explain. He still can't explain, and neither can the neo-Darwinists. But you need to realize something, Karl. This is the part that hurts, you know, the spiritual, religious people. As bad as the bankers are, so are the purveyors of organized religion. Why? They're blocking you. Sorry about that.
Airplane.
Got a lot of construction going on down here in El Salvador. They're blocking you also from the truth about light. And you need to understand they're doing it for the same reason, for control. So when you get right down to it, you will be connected more to the cosmos when you're out in the light that I'm in now. It's very easy, Karl, to be spiritual when you're connected to the light of nature. It's very difficult. You get connected to the dark forces when you're around polarized light. That's kind of the way I would make it simple. And I think it ties a beautiful bow on, you know, your documentary that you're doing. When you understand truly that we are destroyed by who we are, whether it be God or evolution, whatever you believe. Some of us, like me, believe they're both the same. But light controls the whole program. So the key is you need to spend more of your time in the light that nature provides. Why? Because the threads on this planet, the threads in this podcast, these are the same threads that tie us to the cosmos that's above. The same thing that Pacific Ocean behind me ties us to everything. In fact, it's the threads in the quilt of life that connect all of us to the trees around us, to the fish in the sea. That whole story is the story of truly what life is and what life can be. So if you want to call that spiritual, great. People like me, who are what I would call theoretical quantum biologists, we call it obvious. Why? Because the data has led us there. I don't know how you can't be spiritual when you understand truly how the system works. And that's not good. The truck can't make it up the hill. What happens when you live on volcanoes? What I was saying though is you can't help be spiritual when you're connected with nature. And I think even those of us who are non-spiritual, I think the more time you spend in nature pondering, some of the big questions that you may have in your own head, then I think you get to a place of peace, because you begin to realize it's pretty amazing that the waste product of this tree right here is beneficial for me, and my waste product is beneficial for it. It's a perfect symbiosis. And then when you think about a mitochondria and all the stories that we've already talked about, it basically reverse all the processes in photosynthesis. That's the reason why, or underpins why, this parasitology between plants and us exists. When you begin to ask the question, why do these relationships exist? And that's when you begin to realize that everything in the cosmos is decentralized. And the most decentralized part, I think, of science is the science of light. Light is the most complex thing that's out there. And it's kind of ironic that every single religion, at least that I've studied, light is a big part of its story. And again, none of their religions ever solved the recipe. My opinion, neither has science. And I think the ultimate search for spirituality is going to be found probably in the next 50, 100 years, if the government doesn't pollute the new science of quantum biology, where people are out there, looking at all these fundamentals that I've shared with you. Right now, that ball game it's the first inning, and so far the leadoff hitter is still up. It's a 1-2 count. That's how early the game is.
I got to tell you something, but before we wrap, I saw a podcast with a psychologist who observed schizophrenic patients in a mental hospital. And first thing he thought was that the voices that people hear in their head are not hallucinations, but are rational with personalities. And the second thing he said was that the schizophrenics are all afraid of when the sun goes down, because that's when the voices get louder.
It's true. And, that's the thing about quantum biology that's interesting. And I already gave you the answer why that happens. When melanin hits the skin, it really controls those 4 atoms. Those 4 atoms control the light show. What is schizophrenia in the frontal lobes? It is the most chronic, chaotic release of dopamine. Dopamine is an aromatic amino acid. I should say it's made from aromatic amino acids, which absorb UV light. Okay, remember those 3 analogies I gave you of how the outside affects the inside? Well, here's another one. So dopamine is controlled by that aromatic amino acid. So what he effectively just told you is a 4th layer of how the outside controls the inside, even when the system has short circuits in the frontal lobes. They know that they're better when they're in the sun. The problem is they don't know what gave them the short circuits to begin with.
So there's no like pharmaceutical solution here. It's not some chemical imbalance.
It's not a chemical imbalance. It's actually a wiring diagram problem in the mitochondria. It allows the mitochondria in both frontal lobes through that habenular nucleus to shoot very chaotic. Like if you looked at the dopamine spikes or you looked at the EEG spikes of a schizophrenic, you would see the most chaotic thing you ever saw. Like most people understand like depression and suicide. That's a low dopamine state. That's not as much chaos. That's what happens in the frontal lobes. Schizophrenics are exactly the opposite. Again, problem with dopamine, except now the dopamine is uncontrolled and spikes constantly. Well, the interesting thing is when they're in the sun, the spiking goes down. When they're in the darkness, it goes absolutely bonkers. And what does that fundamentally tell you? Based on the story I told you, this has got to go to some issue of controlling those atoms in the mitochondria Jack just talked about iron, copper, manganese, and molybdenum. And that's exactly what it is. And the reason why, what's the common tie for those 4 atoms from the GOE? They're all transition metals. They all have D shell electrons. D shell electrons are very, very interactive with EMF. So let me tell you now a spiritual story. that ties to this. I think you'll like it. If you're a physicist, do you know what causes a supernova or a star to blow up? When the core of a star gets filled with iron. That's atomic number 26. Do you know why it happens? Because the EMF made from the star interacts with the D shell electrons and blows it up. That's exactly what happens in schizophrenia. That's what causes the same problem. Now, what do we call that process in biology? It's called ferroapoptosis. Okay? Don't expect you to know it. Don't expect most of the people to know it. But why do I say it to you, Karl? I want you to understand that physics is the fundamental science of biology. Biology is not fundamental. And I just explained to you how a blowed up star creates a supernova. The same thing is happening to the neurons in a schizophrenic's frontal lobe. When they lose control of iron in their brain through polarized light, that's where schizophrenia comes from. That's where the nuclear weapons blow up. And then in that, how shall we say, field of Gaza, you still have to have the ability to function. And what, even in Gaza, as bad as it is, when the sun comes out, those people tend to do better. What does that tell you? It goes back to Genesis. Let there be light. Problem is, no one's teaching them, how to use it properly. And do I believe that somewhere down the road, 50 to 100 years, when people look at some of my work after I'm dead, they're going to go, Jesus, this guy figured a lot of this shit out, and we all thought he was crazy. And it turns out he wasn't crazy at all. He was looking at the process of 4.6 billion years in evolution that controlled the process of how light from the outside controlled the inside so that we could be normal, not schizophrenic, not brain damaged, not a sexual deviant, not fat, not a person that needs Viagra, not a person whose hair falls out and has hypothyroidism. You understand? Like, no one has a deficiency of pharmaceuticals. People have a deficiency of the light on this planet because of the choices they made, how they live it. And when you tell people it's this simple, they argue with you because they can't fathom it's correct. But Karl, that's why if you go to my house right inside here, on the wall is a big rhinoceros, full size, that's gold. Why is it there? I don't have to teach rhinoceros quantum physics or quantum biology. They know exactly what to do in Africa. Okay? They don't have frontal lobes that allow them to change their environment. We do. Therein lies the difference. That's the reason that God or evolution had to make it this simple, that the outside controls the inside. Because when you do that and you live outside, rhinoceroses, leopards, lions, monkeys, they can live in harmony. We don't. Instead, we blow people up in Gaza so that we can control their land and take their oil. That's the history of humanity. We are a warring people. Why? Because for most of human history that's recorded, that's what humans have done, because they don't live like a rhinoceros.
I know that a lot of the American Indian tribes have actual rituals to welcome the sun coming up, rituals and prayers and so on. These people who lived according to Mother Nature.
They're the last humans on the planet that really got it right. And then what's the story of them? The white man with no melanin came in and destroyed them because they thought they were savages. Who is the real savage? See, it depends on your perspective. And, here's the funny part. What controls perspective? Dopamine. Go figure that out. See, when you actually see it from the quantum biologic perspective, you start to go, Jesus, everything that's in our history books is really written from this altered dopamine perspective. Correct. And I'm telling you the same thing right now. But the thing is, you don't come to these thoughts until you're out in the sun. I would love to tell you that I had a lot of this laid out in my head when I was 15, 20, 25, 30 years old. No, it really became obvious to me between the ages of probably 40 and 65. And What have I done through that process of my life? Through podcasts like this. I write Patreon blogs. I write books to explain to people the basics of how all this stuff works so that you can make sense of what's printed in the New York Times, what's printed on Twitter, what's going on, in France, what's going on in Afghanistan. So you can understand that really it's a big giant control grid that the elites are using light at some level to control the paradigm or via propaganda. People don't understand that. They think there's no way it could be that simple. I got news for you, my friend. I mean, it's so simple. And this is the analogy I give to those people who are poor first principle thinkers. Go to New York City, my hometown, and you want to see absolute chaos? All you got to do is take control of the electromagnetism that controls traffic lights. Traffic lights are just like modern technology. When you change the red and the green lights the wrong place, what do you get? You get gridlock. That's chaos. That's exactly what happens in your brain when you imbibe polarized light, blue light. It's just like screwing up all the traffic lights on First Avenue, Second Avenue, Third Avenue, Lexington, Madison, Park, Fifth, Columbus Circle, Central Park West. It becomes a freaking nightmare. But you don't realize at the core of this problem was electromagnetism. You don't even realize that traffic lights are a beautiful analogy to why dementia, why sexual deviancy really happens. Until you see it from the dopamine perspective, that's built when you sit in nature. But that's how things really work.
Wow. Well, it's a lot to chew on. And I've learned a lot, and I appreciate your time and thoughts and work. And I hope people can learn a lot from watching this. And one more thing I wanted to ask you, cholesterol. We're told that you got to watch your cholesterol levels. If it gets too high, you take statins or whatever.
Nope. more flexion report bullshit. Why? Now the fifth outside in story. Where's cholesterol? It's in your skin and your brain. Your skin and your brain are neuroectodermal derivatives from the embryo. Okay? Just remember that. So how does it work? UV light hits cholesterol in your skin. You make a cholesterol ester. It's not important what it is. That ester goes to your liver and your kidneys and turns it into the active form of vitamin D. So what is cholesterol? Cholesterol is incredibly important. The story that the lipidologists in centralized Rockefeller medicine try to tell you is that LDL cholesterol is bad, HDL is good. Also bullshit. What you need to understand is the main difference between both of them is the number of electrons they have. Then I'm going to take you back to Einstein, the famous guy that won the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect that determines the story about electrons. Remember I told you before that health is a net negative charge. That's what the photoelectric effect is all about. Electrons are what absorb light. Oh, so it turns out cholesterol is really good for you. I'm going to tell you, if you look at the most famous study that was lied about in the New York Times, it was the 50-year Framingham study. You go back and look in January, I think in 99, it was their 50-year anniversary. Read the original print. What does it say in there? It says, what did we find in Framingham? Those with the highest LDL cholesterol live the longest and have the least amount of cancer. Those that have the lowest LDL die the soonest and they tend to get cancer. And what did you just tell me, Carl? Tell me about this cholesterol story. What's the story been since that 50 years? That cholesterol is the worst thing ever. Also a guy that worked for DARPA, Ansel Keys. He's the one that started that with the 7-country study. Total bullshit so that Big Pharma could sell you statins. Okay? You buy a statin, guaranteed you're a retard. You want to be able to think. It's another control mechanism. So go eat your steak, go eat your fish, go eat all your animal proteins. Don't worry about it. The only thing you need to do Let's get out in the sun more than you have in the past, and you'll be fine.
Okay. Well, I will endeavor to do that.
Good. Glad to hear it.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, doctor. I really appreciate your time.
No problem. Anytime.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.